The air hung thick and heavy, a cloying blend of mildew, dust, and something far more metallic, the unmistakable tang of dried blood. I pulled the collar of my jacket tighter, not against the chill, but against the sheer oppressiveness of the place. This wasn't just an old building. It was a tomb, a monument to forgotten suffering. The yellowed caution tape strung across the entrance to the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing, with old records fluttered weakly in a non-existent breeze. A flimsy barrier against the ghosts I imagined still lingered within. "User GQ, glad I re here," the detective called out, his voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. He stood near the entrance, a burly silhouette against the weak morning light filtering through grimy windows. "It's a mess." I nodded, my gaze already sweeping past him, assessing the environment. My boots crunched on fallen plaster and shattered glass as I stepped inside, the sound amplifying the silence. The main corridor stretched into gloom, lined with peeling paint and doors ajar, revealing empty, decaying rooms. The ceiling had sagged in places, exposing skeletal wooden beams. This wasn't just abandoned, it felt devoured by time. "Give me a minute," I replied, my voice calm, professional. I needed to calibrate myself, to filter out the overwhelming sensory input and focus on the scientific. My kit bag felt heavy on my shoulder, a familiar comfort. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the material snapping taut against my skin, creating a barrier between me and the decay. The detective pointed towards a doorway further down the corridor. "In there, second room on the left. We haven't touched anything, just secured the perimeter." I moved methodically, my eyes scanning the floor, the walls, the air itself. Every step was deliberate. This wing was a labyrinth of forgotten lives, and now it housed a new tragedy. The room the detective indicated was larger than the others, an old common area perhaps, or a ward. Broken fluorescent light fixtures dangled precariously from the ceiling, their wires exposed like severed nerves. A large, overturned wooden table lay in the center, its legs splayed, and there beside it was the victim. My breath hitched, a brief, involuntary reaction before my training kicked in. The body lay sprawled on the grimy concrete floor, amidst scattered paper and debris. It was a man, dressed in faded, unremarkable clothing. The sheer brutality of the scene was immediate, visceral. This wasn't a quiet passing, it was an explosion of violence. I knelt a few feet away, careful not to disturb anything, my eyes tracking every detail. The victim's right arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, fingers curled into a claw. There were defensive wounds visible on his forearms, deep gashes that had bled profusely. The left side of his chest was a ruin, a gaping wound that indicated a sustained, frenzied attack. A heavy, blunt object, perhaps, or something sharp wielded with immense force. "Any ID yet?" I asked, my voice low, not taking my eyes off the scene. "Nothing on him," the detective replied from the doorway, keeping his distance. "No wallet, no phone. Looks like he was dragged in, or at least moved after the initial assault. See the drag marks on the floor, faint but there, leading from the corridor. I had already noted them, subtle abrasions on the dust-laden concrete, a slight disturbance in the otherwise uniform layer of grime. They seemed to originate from further down the hall, near where the old record storage room was. My gaze drifted to the periphery of the room. This particular area was filled with stacks of decaying cardboard boxes, overflowing with what looked like patient files, medical records, and administrative documents. The old records part of the wing, precisely. I spent the next 20 minutes in silent, meticulous observation. I photographed the general scene, then moved in closer, documenting the body's position, the wounds, the blood spatter patterns. The blood, already congealing, told its own story: arterial spurts, contact transfers, drip patterns. The sheer volume of it suggested the attack had concluded here, or at least the final, fatal blows had been struck in this spot. As I worked, my attention was drawn to a small detail near the victim's left hand. It wasn't immediately obvious, almost obscured by a torn piece of a patient's chart. I leaned in closer, my headlamp cutting through the gloom. I carefully used my tweezers to lift it, placing it into a sterile evidence bag. It looked like a piece of a broken watch, but it was too early to tell. Then, as I shifted my weight, my gaze fell upon the chaotic stacks of records. Most of the boxes were haphazardly piled, their contents spilling out, but one box, half hidden beneath a collapsed shelf, seemed different. Its lid was askew, and a single file protruded not carelessly, but almost deliberately. It was a thick, brown folder, much older than the others, its edges frayed. What caught my eye wasn't the folder itself, but a faint, almost imperceptible scratch mark on its surface. It was a thin, deliberate line, like someone had dragged a sharp point across it, almost erasing a tiny, printed number on the label. I paused, my internal monologue shifting gears. A scratch. In this chaos, it could be anything. But something about its precision, its placement directly over a specific numeral, felt wrong, like a deliberate act, not an accident. I carefully reached for the folder, my gloved fingers brushing against the brittle paper. The file was labeled with a patient name, faded and difficult to read, and a series of numbers. The scratch was precisely over the last digit of the patient ID number. My mind began to whir. Why scratch out one digit? Was it a mistake? Or was it a message? A redirection? This wasn't a detail the average person would notice, certainly not in the immediate horror of the scene, but it snagged at me. It felt like a whisper in the silent screaming room. This wasn't going to be a straightforward case, not with this kind of meticulous, almost imperceptible manipulation. My initial assessment of a brutal, frenzied attack was still valid, but this small, deliberate alteration hinted at a layer of cunning beneath the savagery. The perpetrator wasn't just violent, they were clever, and that made everything infinitely more dangerous. This particular area was too clean, in a way. Not sterile, of course. Nothing in the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records was sterile, but rather undisturbed. The dust layer here was uniform, pristine, unlike the subtle scuff marks I'd seen near the entrance to the record storage. It confirmed my initial thought. The struggle hadn't happened here. My gut tightened. This wasn't going to be a straightforward case. I spent another hour documenting, collecting, and double-checking, the air thick with the smell of decay and forgotten lives. The detective, a burly man with a perpetually tired gaze, hovered nearby, occasionally grunting a question. He seemed eager to wrap things up, his focus on the obvious trauma to the victim's body. But my eyes were drawn to the periphery, the anomalies, the things that whispered of a story beyond the immediate tableau of violence. Finally, with the last evidence bag sealed and tagged, I nodded to the crime scene technician. I've got what I need for now. The drive back to the lab was a blur of city lights and the quiet hum of the evidence containers in the back of the SUV. I felt the familiar shift in gears, from the chaos of the scene to the methodical order of my domain. The lab, with its gleaming surfaces and precise instruments, was a stark contrast to the grimy, desolate hospital wing. Here, I was in control, a quiet architect of truth. I started with the victim's clothing, carefully unwrapping the evidence bag. The fabric was a standard cotton blend, stained darkly in places, but beneath the obvious damage, I was searching for the minute. Using forceps, I plucked at a few stray fibers clinging to the trousers, then moved to the soles of the victim's worn work boots. The boots were caked with a mix of dried mud and fine, gray dust consistent with the abandoned hospital. But as I gently scraped a sample into a petri dish, a tiny glint caught my eye. It was metallic, almost iridescent, embedded deep within the sole's tread. Under the stereo microscope, the fragment resolved into a sliver of what looked like aged copper, oddly shaped and fused with a gritty particulate. Copper wasn't out of place in an old building, but its form here was peculiar. I logged it, noting its location on the boot, and moved on. My focus shifted to the trace evidence collected from the floor where the body had been found. Dust, debris, hair. Fibers a microcosm of the immediate environment. I systematically processed the samples, my mind sifting through possibilities, ruling out the mundane. The police theory, delivered with a shrug by the detective, was a simple robbery gone wrong. A lone victim, an opportunistic attacker. But that didn't explain the abrasions on the concrete or the peculiar sense of a staged scene that had prickled at the back of my neck. Hours melted away. Hum of the ventilation system was the only sound in my corner of the lab. I had a sample of dust and grime from the concrete floor near the record storage room, the area where I'd first noticed the subtle disturbances. I mounted a tiny portion on a slide, added a drop of immersion oil, and leaned into the eyepiece of the compound microscope. The field of view swam into focus, a chaotic landscape of dust mites, textile fibers, and mineral fragments. Standard fare. But then there it was. Not one, but several microscopic shards of something unlike anything else I'd seen so far. They almost looked like fragments of brittle, aged paper, but with an unusual sheen. And clinging to the edges of these paper-like fragments, I saw something else. A viscous, almost oily residue, shimmering with a faint, metallic sheen much like the fragment I'd found on the victim's boot, but in a different form. My breath hitched. This wasn't just dust. This was a signature. I adjusted the focus, bringing the details into sharper relief. The residue wasn't a common grease. It had a unique viscosity, a specific hue. It looked like a very old, specialized industrial lubricant, the kind used for heavy machinery, not something I'd find casually lying around an abandoned hospital wing. And the paper fragments, they were too old, too specific in their deterioration to be mere office waste. They had the characteristic fibrous structure of heavily processed paper pulp, like that used in archival documents, but brittle with age and neglect. I pulled back from the eyepiece, the image seared into my mind. Old lubricant, brittle, aged paper pulp, and the location, near the entrance to the record storage room, where I'd noted those initial abrasions on the concrete. The pieces began to click, forming a disturbing picture. The victim wasn't just killed where he was found. He had been moved, or more likely, something heavy had been dragged, leaving these distinct traces, and that something was connected to the old records and to some forgotten heavy machinery that used this particular lubricant. The simple robbery theory shattered in my mind, replaced by a complex, unsettling puzzle. This wasn't an opportunistic crime, it was deliberate. It spoke of planning, of a perpetrator who knew the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records intimately, perhaps even utilizing its forgotten infrastructure. The tension in the lab, previously a low hum, now thrummed with a new, sharp edge. This case just got significantly more complicated, and I had a feeling this was only the first layer. The lab, with its gleaming surfaces and precise instruments, was a stark contrast to the grim tableau I'd left behind. The quiet hum of the ventilation system was a welcome balm after the sirens and shouted commands of the crime scene. I peeled off my gloves, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to my skin, and began the methodical process of inventorying the evidence. Each bag, each container, held a piece of a puzzle I was determined to solve. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, but my mind was still replaying the scene. The victim, the obvious weapon, the seemingly straightforward narrative the initial responders had pieced together. But something had nagged at me, a subtle dissonance. It was the way the victim's left shoe had scuffed the floor, a tiny, almost imperceptible drag mark that seemed out of place. I started with the shoes. Under the powerful magnification of the stereo microscope, the sole revealed more than just street grime. Embedded deep in a worn tread, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a minuscule fragment. It wasn't fabric, nor wood, nor concrete. It was paper, aged and brittle, no bigger than a grain of rice, and on its surface, a faint smear of what looked like ink. This wasn't ordinary office paper. The fibers were coarse, the coloration an uneven, yellowish cream, and the ink had a peculiar, almost purplish-brown hue I hadn't seen in modern pens. This was my dissonance. I spent the next few hours meticulously analyzing the fragment. The paper composition pointed to a very specific, almost obsolete manufacturing process. The ink, even more so. It wasn't just old. It was a formulation I recognized from my studies of historical documents, a blend of iron gall and a plant-derived pigment that had fallen out of common use by the mid-20th century. This wasn't something I'd pick up walking down a city street. This was a clue, meticulously hidden by circumstance or design. Just as I was about to dive deeper into historical ink databases, the lab door swung open. The lead detective, a man whose tie always seemed a little too tight, strode in, a smirk playing on his lips. "User GQ," he announced, his voice booming slightly in the quiet space. "Good news, we've got our man." I looked up from my microscope, my brow furrowed. "Oh, yeah, a colleague of the victim. Bad blood over a promotion, apparently. He was found him holed up at his apartment, trying to ditch some bloody clothes. Confession is practically imminent. We're just waiting on the warrant." He leaned against a workbench, arms crossed, clearly pleased with himself. "Looks like this one's wrapped up." I peeled off my gloves slowly. "Wrapped up," I echoed, picking up the tweezers and carefully placing the paper fragment into a secure slide. "Detective, "I've found something that complicates my neat package." His smirk faltered. "Complicates what?" "We have motive, opportunity, and a suspect trying to destroy evidence. And I have a fragment of antique paper, stained with an archaic ink, embedded in the victim's shoe," I countered, pushing the slide towards him. "This isn't from the victim's office or his home or my suspect's apartment. This paper, and specifically this ink, points to a very particular kind of historical document, likely from an institutional setting, probably pre-1960s. He picked up the slide, squinting at the tiny speck. "So, he stepped on some old trash. What does that have to do with anything? It means the victim was somewhere else entirely, or someone who was tracked this in. It means there's another layer here I haven't even scratched." I insisted, my voice firm. "This isn't just old trash. This ink is specific enough that I might be able to trace its origin. And if I can, it might tell us where the victim was before the attack, or where the actual perpetrator has been." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "Look, user GQ, I appreciate my thoroughness, but we have a suspect. Let's not go chasing ghosts when we have a solid lead." "Forensics doesn't chase ghosts, detective. It chases facts," I said, meeting his gaze. "And this fragment is a fact. It doesn't fit my narrative. Not yet." He grumbled something under his breath about scientists and their obsessions, but I could tell I'd planted a seed of doubt, however small. He left, the lab door closing with a soft click, leaving me alone with my fragment and a growing conviction that his solved case was anything but. I returned to my research, cross-referencing the unique ink pigment and paper composition. Hours blurred. The specific combination was rare, but not unheard of. It pointed to a period when institutions often produced their own stationery or used specialized suppliers for record-keeping. My search narrowed, eventually leading me to a handful of regional facilities, many of them now defunct. One name kept resurfacing: a long-closed mental health facility on the outskirts of the city, known for its extensive, if poorly maintained, archives. The next morning, armed with a search warrant, I'd convinced a skeptical prosecutor was necessary. Unusual forensic evidence requires unusual investigative avenues. I'd argued I found myself driving towards the coordinates. The GPS led me down a crumbling access road, past rusted gates and overgrown weeds that clawed at the asphalt. The building itself loomed against the gray sky, a hulking, decaying monument to forgotten suffering. This was the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The air inside was thick with dust and the cloying smell of decay, a mix of mildewed paper and something vaguely metallic. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating peeling paint, shattered windows, and overturned furniture. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of unseen rodents, amplified the tension that tightened my shoulders. This place felt like a tomb, each room a testament to lives lived and then discarded. I followed the faded signs to records. The door hung ajar, revealing shelves upon shelves of cardboard boxes, their contents spilling out in disarray. Patient files, administrative ledgers, correspondence, all coated in a thick layer of grime. This was exactly the kind of environment where my paper fragment could have originated. Donning a respirator and gloves, I began my search. The sheer volume of documents was overwhelming. I focused on the period matching my ink analysis, sifting through brittle pages, my eyes scanning for any detail, any name that might resonate with the crime scene or the victim. The silence was profound, broken only by my own breathing and the distant hoot of an owl. After what felt like an eternity, my flashlight beam landed on a particularly thick, leather-bound register, half buried under a pile of loose patient charts. Its spine was cracked, but the title, embossed in faded gold, read, Admissions 1958-1962. I carefully opened it. The pages were filled with elegant, looping cursive, written in that exact purplish-brown ink. This was it, the source. My fingers traced the names, dates, and brief notes. Many were illegible, blurred by time and damp. Then, halfway through the ledger, a name jumped out at me. It wasn't the victim's name, nor the initial suspect's, but next to the entry in the reason for admission column was a single cryptic word, obsession, and tucked between the brittle pages of the register, a small, identical fragment of paper, just like the one I'd found on the victim's shoe. This one, however, had a partial handwritten note on it in the same unique ink. It read, The Garden Key, My breath hitched. The garden key. A small, almost insignificant detail I'd dismissed at the crime scene, a tiny brass key found near the victim's hand, seemingly unrelated to anything in his apartment. It wasn't a house key or a car key. It was an old, ornate garden key, a key to what I hadn't known, until now. The connection was undeniable, chilling. This wasn't just a random fragment. This was a direct link. The initial suspect was wrong. This went deeper, far deeper, into the forgotten corners of history and obsession. The garden key. It had gnawed at me since I'd first seen it, lying incongruously near the victim's hand. Not a house key, not a car key, but an old, ornate brass key, the kind I'd imagined turning in a heavy iron gate, perhaps to a sprawling, forgotten estate. The detective had shrugged it off as a trinket, another random item in a chaotic scene. But my gut, that persistent, nagging instinct that had saved me from countless dead ends, wouldn't let it go. I spent the next morning back in the lab, the key sitting on a sterile white cloth under the microscope. Its intricate filigree, the slight corrosion in the crevices, it told a story of age, of exposure to the elements. I ran a quick scan, looking for trace evidence, but it was clean, almost too clean. Someone had wiped it down. My mind raced, trying to connect this antique piece of metal to the sleek, modern apartment where the victim had been found. There was no garden, no ornate gate, nothing that even hinted at such a thing. Still obsessed with the key user GQ, the detective's voice broke my concentration. He stood by the doorway, a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand. I looked up, pushing my glasses further up my nose. It doesn't fit. Nothing about this key fits the scene. That's precisely why it's important. He sighed, taking a slow sip. Maybe it's just a decorative piece or an old family heirloom. Heirlooms usually have a story, a place. This one feels displaced, like it was left there intentionally or dropped by mistake. I zoomed in on a minute scratch near the key's bow. I need to go back to the apartment. There has to be something I missed, something that connects the victim to this. The detective just nodded, already turning to leave. Let me know if I find a secret garden. Otherwise, we've got other leads. I ignored him. My resolve hardened. This wasn't about gardens, it was about the why. Why was this specific key there? Back at the victim's apartment, the scene was still secured, though much of the initial chaos had been processed. I moved methodically, my eyes scanning for any anomaly, any object that felt out of place. The living room, a sterile landscape of minimalist furniture, yielded nothing. The kitchen, equally sparse. I moved into the small study, filled with books on finance and economics, the victim's professional world. And then I saw it. Tucked behind a thick hardback on global markets, almost completely obscured, was a small, faded sepia photograph. It was old, curling at the edges, depicting an overgrown, ivy-choked stone wall. But what caught my eye was the glimpse of an ornate iron gate, partially visible through a tangle of wild roses. The gate, though weathered, had a distinct, almost familiar pattern. And in the bottom corner of the photo, barely legible, was a handwritten inscription, Sanctuary 1978. My breath caught. Sanctuary. That was the unofficial name for the old, abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town, the one with the sprawling, neglected grounds. It had been shut down decades ago, its history shrouded in local rumor and urban legend. I remembered hearing whispers about a specific wing, the one where they kept the most challenging cases and where all the old patient records were supposedly stored. I clutched the photograph, the paper thin and fragile beneath my fingertips, an ornate gate, a psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The pieces were starting to click into place, forming a picture far more disturbing than a simple domestic dispute. Within the hour, I was driving my SUV down a potholed, tree-lined road, the dense canopy overhead casting long, shifting shadows. The air grew cooler, heavier. The old hospital loomed in the distance, a hulking silhouette against the bruised afternoon sky. The main entrance was boarded up, but I knew of a service gate rarely checked. I parked discreetly, grabbing my forensic kit and a heavy-duty flashlight. The gate, when I found it, was indeed old iron, rusted shut with a thick chain. No amount of pushing or pulling would open it. This wasn't the gate in the photo. Finally, I found it. Hidden behind a thicket of thorny bushes, almost completely swallowed by overgrown ivy, was a smaller, more ornate gate, its intricate ironwork mirroring the faint pattern in the photograph. It was locked, of course, with a heavy, old-fashioned padlock. I fumbled in my pocket for the brass key. My fingers trembled slightly as I inserted it into the keyhole. It slid in smoothly. A perfect fit. With a soft click, the lock sprang open. I pushed the gate inward, sending a shower of rust and dried leaves to the ground. The path beyond was choked with weeds, leading deeper into the forgotten grounds. The path wound its way to the rear of the main hospital building, where a smaller, detached structure stood, almost completely hidden by dense trees. This had to be it, the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The door to the wing was ajar, hanging precariously on a single hinge. Inside, the gloom was absolute, broken only by the thin beams of my flashlight. Dust motes danced in the light, thick as snow. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and old paper. Empty patient rooms lined a long corridor, their doors agape like gaping mouths. I pushed deeper, guided by a sense of urgency. I found the records section at the very end of the corridor. Shelves upon shelves of decaying cardboard boxes, filled with yellowed files stretched from floor to ceiling. The sheer volume was overwhelming. I knew I couldn't search everyone. I needed a specific lead. My flashlight beam swept across the labels, many faded beyond recognition. Admissions, discharge, general ward. Then I spotted a section marked Restricted Access Experimental Cases. My pulse quickened. This felt right. These files were housed in a series of sturdy wooden cabinets, each with its own heavy, old-fashioned lock. I tried the key again, my hands slick with sweat. The first cabinet, no. The second, no. This place was unnerving, every creak and groan of the old building sounding like a whisper in the dark. Then the fourth cabinet, the key slid in. I pulled the heavy wooden door open, revealing rows of thick, bound files. Unlike the other boxes, these were meticulously organized, almost pristine. My flashlight landed on a particular folder, tucked behind several others. Its label typed rather than handwritten, Project Chimera Patient 734. I pulled it out, the old paper crackling in my hands. Inside, it wasn't a standard patient history. The report detailed an experimental therapy designed to enhance these traits, not cure them, for undisclosed purposes. It even mentioned a unique method of creating invisible evidence, traces so subtle they were almost impossible to detect without knowing exactly what to look for. My eyes scanned the pages, the words blurring, then sharpening into stark clarity. Subject possesses advanced skills in misdirection and the subtle implantation of false leads. The victim's apartment, the seemingly straightforward murder, the perfectly clean garden key. It wasn't simple. It was a masterwork of deception. This wasn't just a killer, it was an architect of lies, a manipulator of perception. The case had just cracked wide open, revealing a depth of cunning I hadn't even begun to imagine. The tension in the dusty, silent wing thickened, suddenly suffocating. I wasn't just investigating a murder, I was hunting a ghost, a phantom who could make evidence appear and disappear at will. A cold wave washed over me. It wasn't simple. The case had just cracked wide open, revealing a new, unsettling depth. I didn't waste a second. The lab beckoned, a sanctuary of controlled chaos where answers hid in plain sight. I went straight for the evidence locker, pulling out the sealed bag containing the key. My initial examination had been thorough, but now I knew what I was looking for. Not a trace left behind, but a signature of absence, or perhaps something even more subtle, a deliberate misdirection. Under the scanning electron microscope, the key, a mundane piece of brass, glowed with an eerie light. I'd already noted the lack of skin cells, the absence of typical soil residue from a garden. But this time I wasn't just looking for what wasn't there. I was looking for the ghost of what had been. Hours blurred. My eyes ached, but adrenaline kept me sharp. I meticulously scanned every millimeter of the key's surface, adjusting magnification, filtering light. And then there it was. Not a smudge, not a fingerprint, but a microscopic shimmer. A residue so fine, so evenly dispersed, it looked almost like part of the metal itself. I isolated a sample. Chemical analysis followed, a battery of tests I ran myself, needing to see the results with my own eyes. The spectrograph hummed, spitting out data. The composition was unusual. It wasn't a standard household cleaner. This was a specialized polymer, a synthetic resin, mixed with an abrasive compound. It was designed to remove stubborn grime without scratching delicate surfaces, leaving behind an almost invisible protective film. A very specific kind of polish, one I'd only ever encountered in one particular context. My breath hitched. This wasn't something you bought at a grocery store. This was an industrial-grade product, often used in places requiring meticulous hygiene and preservation of sensitive equipment. Places like museums, high-tech manufacturing clean rooms, or medical facilities. I called the detective. "We have a breakthrough," I said, my voice tight with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The garden key, it wasn't just cleaned. It was professionally polished with a highly specialized compound, a polymer abrasive mix. It's almost unique. There was a pause on the other end. Unique how, user GQ? It's a specific brand, primarily distributed to institutional clients. Think hospitals, research labs, maybe even some older, large-scale maintenance operations. It leaves behind a microscopic film that prevents further corrosion and repels contaminants. The killer didn't just clean the key, they preserved it. They didn't want any trace of themselves or anyone else to ever appear on that surface. It's a signature of extreme, almost obsessive control. "So, we're looking for someone with access to this kind of industrial cleaner," the detective mused. "Someone who's worked in a specific kind of environment." "Precisely. And the particular formulation I found, it's an older variant, still produced, but it was far more common a decade or two ago. That narrows the field further. We need to find distribution records for this specific product, especially for that older batch, and cross-reference them with anyone who might have had a connection to the victim or their associates." The lead was solid, but it felt heavy, chilling. This level of premeditation, this meticulous attention to detail, spoke of a mind far more calculating than we'd initially presumed. It wasn't just about committing a murder. It was about orchestrating a perfect, untraceable crime. A few hours later, after a frantic search through industrial supplier databases, we had a list. One name in particular kept popping up, a major supplier to various public institutions across the state, including several hospitals and long-term care facilities. And among their older client records, there was a particularly large, consistent order for that exact compound from a place that had since closed down. "This is our best bet," the detective stated, tapping a finger on a dusty printout. "The Psychiatric Hospital Abandoned, wing with old records. It was a massive facility, shut down about 15 years ago. Could be a gold mine for anyone wanting to get their hands on old supplies, or for someone who worked there and developed a particular set of skills." The thought sent a shiver down my spine. A psychiatric hospital, obsessive control. We arrived as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. The Psychiatric Hospital Abandoned, wing with old records, stood like a skeletal monument to forgotten suffering. Vines clawed at crumbling brickwork, windows stared out blankly shattered panes like missing teeth. The air was thick with the scent of decay, dust, and something else, a lingering desolation. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of our boots on scattered debris. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust. We moved through long, empty corridors, past peeling paint and rusted gurneys, until we found the record's wing. It was a cavernous space, rows upon rows of steel shelving, each crammed with moldering files and yellowed ledgers. "This is going to take forever," the detective muttered, pulling out a flashlight. "We're looking for employee records, maintenance logs, anything that details who had access to specific cleaning supplies, who had an unusual interest in them," I instructed, already pulling a box labeled Maintenance 1990-2005 from a shelf. The dust coated my hands, gritty and ancient. The search was grueling. Every file we opened released a puff of stale air and the ghost of a forgotten life. We sifted through countless documents, patient charts, staff rosters, supply requisitions. My eyes scanned for any mention of the specialized polymer, any name that stood out for its meticulousness or unusual behavior. Then, tucked away in a box marked Purchasing Obsolete Stock, I found it. A requisition order, dated nearly 2 decades ago, for a bulk shipment of the exact cleaning compound. Beside it, a handwritten note from the head of maintenance, complaining about an employee's excessive and peculiar use of the product, far beyond what was necessary for their assigned duties. The employee's name was neatly typed below the note. It wasn't just a revelation about the perpetrator's M.O. It was a direct link, a name that suddenly made the entire twisted puzzle snap into place. The suspect pool had just shrunk to a single, terrifying possibility. The bruised purples and oranges of the sunset bled into the grimy windows of the psychiatric hospital, casting long, distorted shadows as we pulled up. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of decay and disuse. This wasn't just an abandoned building. This was the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records, a place where forgotten lives whispered in the drafts. "All right, user GQ," the detective said, his voice low, "lead the way. What are we looking for?" I adjusted the beam of my heavy-duty flashlight, illuminating a crumbling facade. Anything that screams obsessive control or meticulous planning. Specifically, I'm thinking about patient records, staff logs, anything that might link a former employee or patient with the kind of calculated precision we saw at the crime scene. We pushed through a set of rusted double doors that groaned like a dying beast. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of plaster dust and shattered glass under our boots. My flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing peeling paint, overturned furniture, and drifts of ancient paperwork. This wing was a graveyard of forgotten bureaucracy. "This is it," I murmured, my gaze sweeping over rows of metal filing cabinets, their drawers ajar, spilling yellowed folders onto the floor. The records section, a wave of dust motes danced in my beam as I moved deeper, my senses on high alert. The air was cold, stale, carrying a faint medicinal tang that clung to the decaying paper. I started methodically, pulling out files, skimming names and dates, looking for any pattern, any anomaly. Most were mundane, sad histories of mental illness. But then a particular drawer, slightly ajar, caught my eye. It was labeled staff discharged. Unlike the patient files, these seemed less disturbed. "Here," I called out, pulling a thick folder. "This one feels different." The detective came over, his own light joining mine. Inside, among standard employment records, was a series of meticulously handwritten notes, almost like a personal diary, tucked into the back of a staff member's file. The entries were dated years apart, detailing observations of specific patients, their habits, their routines, even their visitors. One entry, dated 5 years prior, explicitly mentioned a particular patient's fragile mind and susceptibility to influence. It outlined a plan to guide them. The victim's name, or rather a coded reference to them, was unmistakable. "This isn't just a record." I breathed, my finger tracing the unnervingly neat script. "This is a blueprint, a long-term project." The detective snatched the folder, his eyes narrowing. "We've got him. This matches the profile I've been building perfectly." He barked orders into his radio, the sudden burst of static jarring in the quiet decay. "We have a positive identification, likely location." The suspect, identified from the staff file, was apparently known to frequent a derelict apartment block on the city's east side, a place he'd listed as a secondary address years ago. The police response was immediate, a whirlwind of flashing blue lights and screeching tires that tore through the night. I found myself in the back of a patrol car, listening to the crackle of the radio, the detective relaying my findings, the urgency in his voice palpable. They were closing in. "Suspect sighted," a voice cut through the static. On foot, heading towards the old industrial park, my heart hammered against my ribs, a dull percussion against the backdrop of the chase. This was it, the culmination of weeks of painstaking work. Then the report started to shift. "He's lost us. Used the old storm drain system, dropped out of sight." Another voice, frustrated. He knew the layout, too many blind spots. Cunning, that word echoed in my mind. He hadn't just run, he'd used the environment. Just as he'd used the victim, just as he'd used the crime scene to mislead us. This wasn't a desperate flight, it was a pre-planned evasion. "He's too clever for a simple foot chase," I stated, my voice cutting through the tension in the car. "He anticipated this. Every move he makes is calculated." I leaned forward, my mind already racing ahead, past the physical pursuit. "We need to switch tactics. Did anyone see him with a phone? Anything at all that could transmit a signal?" The detective, who had been listening intently to the radio, turned to me, his expression grim. "A patrol officer thought he saw him toss something into a dumpster right before he went into the storm drain. He's meticulous, remember? He wouldn't leave anything to chance. That level of planning extends to his digital footprint too. We need to go digital. His movements, his communications, his online presence." Everything. I need access to every scrap of digital information we can get our hands on, starting with that dumpster. The chase had failed, but it had revealed the true depth of his cunning. He was a ghost in the physical world, but no one was truly invisible in the digital one. The hunt was far from over. It had just moved into a new, complex dimension. The sterile hum of the lab was a constant drone, a counterpoint to the buzzing frustration in my skull. The digital trail had gone cold, a frustrating dead end after a sprint that felt like chasing a mirage. He was good, I had to give him that, a ghost in the physical world, almost as invisible in the digital one. But no one was truly invisible. There was always a ripple, a disturbance. I leaned closer to the microscope, adjusting the fine focus. On the slide, a single-minute fiber glowed faintly under UV light. It was from the victim's jacket, a synthetic blend. Nothing remarkable on its own, but what was remarkable was the infinitesimal speck clinging to it, barely visible even at this magnification. A fleck of something inorganic, almost crystalline, embedded within the weave. It had been catalogued as environmental debris during the initial sweep, one of hundreds of such particles. My gut, however, gnawed at me. Elias Thorne hadn't just walked through the crime scene, he'd meticulously scrubbed it. How could he miss something so small, yet so resilient? The digital breadcrumbs, sparse as they were, had hinted at a pattern, a preference for decaying structures, places forgotten by time. His digital footprint, though obscured, showed repeated, fleeting connections to an old network hub located near what used to be a district of institutional buildings. One place in particular kept surfacing in my mind, a dark, sprawling structure on the edge of the city, long abandoned. Something about the environmental profile of the crime scene. He grunted. Another wild goose chase, user GQ, we're running out of time. Wild geese often lead to hidden nests, I countered, already gathering my field kit. Just give me a few hours. The drive out was long, through industrial zones that bled into neglected suburbs, finally giving way to overgrown fields. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The GPS led me down a crumbling service road, past rusted chain-link fences choked with thorny vines, until the structure loomed into view. The psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records was a monument to neglect. The brickwork was crumbling, ivy snaking up the walls, reclaiming what man had built. I pushed through a section of fence that had long since given up its integrity, the rusted metal groaning in protest. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my boots on shattered glass and fallen plaster. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the gloom, illuminating a scene of utter dereliction. Rooms stretched out, their doors hanging askew, revealing stripped interiors. The air was thick with the smell of damp mold and decaying paper. This was it, the old records wing. Shelves, once laden with patient files, now stood mostly empty, their contents either rotted away or scattered across the floor in a sad, discolored mess. I pulled out my portable vacuum, fitted with a microfilter, and began a methodical sweep. I wasn't looking for fingerprints or footfalls. I was looking for the invisible, the microscopic. What kind of unique particulate matter would cling to a person who spent time here? What could be carried out unwittingly? My eyes scanned the floor, the walls, the remaining documents. Then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible sheen on a section of floorboards near a collapsed filing cabinet, where a patch of light from a broken window briefly illuminated the surface. Not a footprint, not a smear, more like a subtle disturbance in the layer of dust, as if something had been dragged or a heavy object briefly rested there. And within that disturbed area, catching the light, was a glimmer. It was the same almost crystalline speck I'd seen under my microscope. I got down on my knees, carefully collecting samples from the disturbed area, and then, with even greater care, from the surrounding undisturbed dust. I used a fine brush and adhesive lifts, meticulously bagging and labeling each one. My hunch. I prepped the samples from the abandoned wing. Under the powerful electron microscope, the crystalline flecks from the hospital wing glowed with an undeniable familiarity. Their unique mineral composition, their specific morphology, matched perfectly with the one I'd found on the victim's jacket. It wasn't just environmental debris anymore. It was a specific, rare silicate, formed from the unique decay process of the building materials and the specific type of aggregate used in the concrete of that particular wing. Elias Thorne hadn't just visited the crime scene, he'd been in that abandoned wing. He'd carried these specific particles on his clothes, perhaps even his shoes, and then, despite his meticulous cleaning, a few of them had transferred to the victim. It was the microscopic signature of his presence, a forensic duel won by the smallest, most resilient of particles. He thought he'd erased his tracks, but he couldn't erase the environment he walked through. The truth, intricate and undeniable, lay exposed under the lens. The GPS led me down a crumbling service road, past rusted chain-link fences choked with thorny vines, until the skeletal remains of what was once a grand building loomed against the bruised sky. This was it, the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, a fitting prelude to the forgotten secrets I hoped to unearth. I parked the department SUV a discreet distance away, the gravel crunching under the tires like old bones. The building was a hulking shadow, its windows mostly shattered, gaping like empty eye sockets. A gust of wind rattled a loose sheet of metal on the roof, a mournful clang that echoed the desolation. My breath plumed in the cold air as I grabbed my flashlight and a pair of gloves. There was no official entry, no welcoming sign, just a broken side door, its frame splintered, hanging precariously on a single hinge. Stepping inside, the world outside vanished, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light that pierced the grime-coated windows, illuminating a scene of utter neglect. Peeling paint hung from the walls like tattered bandages, and the floor was a treacherous mosaic of broken plaster, fallen ceiling tiles, and what looked suspiciously like desiccated rodent droppings. The first few rooms were former patient wards, rows of rusted bed frames and overturned nightstands. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. My focus, however, was on finding the administrative wing, the repository of the old records. I navigated through the labyrinthine corridors, guided by faint, faded signs that pointed towards admissions and records management. The records room was a disaster. Shelves, once neatly organized, had collapsed under the weight of time and neglect. Thousands of files, bound in faded cardstock, lay scattered across the floor, a paper avalanche. It felt like an impossible task, but I knew what I was looking for, any connection between Elias Thorne and this place, or between Thorne and the victim. I started systematically, picking through the files, my gloved fingers brushing away layers of dust. Patient files, staff rosters, maintenance logs, disciplinary reports, a lifetime of institutional bureaucracy and human frailty. Hours blurred into a monotonous cycle of searching, reading, discarding. My back ached, my eyes strained in the dim light. I found names, dates, diagnoses, but nothing that screamed Thorne. Just as frustration began to gnaw at my resolve, I stumbled upon a section of shelves that miraculously had remained intact. These files were older, bound in thicker, almost leathery covers. They were marked Historical Case Files Special Review. The first file I pulled was thick, heavy. The name on the cover sent a jolt through me. Elias Thorne. My breath hitched. This was it. I opened the file, the brittle paper crackling under my touch. It wasn't a patient file, but an employee file from decades ago. Thorne had worked here as a maintenance supervisor for a short, turbulent period. The file detailed a series of disciplinary actions, complaints of erratic behavior, and eventually his termination. It was a handwritten report from the then chief administrator detailing a specific incident. Thorne had become obsessed with a particular patient, believing they were being unfairly treated, even persecuted. He developed a deep, irrational hatred for the doctor overseeing that patient's care, accusing them of malpractice and worse. The doctor's name, scrawled in elegant cursive, was the victim's name. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The victim had been a doctor here years ago, when Thorne worked in maintenance. Thorne even then displayed signs of paranoia, fixating on perceived injustices. He was terminated, but the grudge festered. The meticulous staging of the murder scene, the almost theatrical precision of the clues, the deliberate misdirection. It wasn't just about covering tracks. It was a performance, a prolonged act of revenge. I continued sifting through Thorne's file, my heart thrumming. Tucked deep within, almost an afterthought, was a folded blueprint. It wasn't a blueprint for the hospital, but for a residential property. A specific property, the victim's house. Thorne, as a maintenance supervisor, would have had access to such documents if the doctor had ever requested work done on their personal residence. The blueprint showed a detailed cross-section of the house, highlighting an unusual cavity built into a wall in the study. A cavity that, according to the notes scrawled in the margin in Thorne's distinct handwriting, was perfect for concealing secrets. The how and why clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Thorne hadn't just known the victim, he'd hated them for decades. The elaborate murder scene, the hidden compartment, the specific placement of the seemingly random objects, it was all a twisted reenactment, a symbolic settling of old scores. The victim's body had been placed in that cavity, not just to hide it, but as a final, macabre statement, a symbolic imprisonment for a perceived past injustice. The clues I'd found, the obscure references, they weren't just breadcrumbs. They were Thorne's personal language of vengeance, a message meant for someone who understood the history, someone who could appreciate the elaborate cruelty. I carefully photographed every relevant page of Thorne's file, the disciplinary reports, the chief administrator's notes, and especially that blueprint. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the revelation. Elias Thorne wasn't just a killer, he was a meticulous architect of revenge, his plot simmering for decades, finally erupting into violence. I called the detective from outside, the signal thankfully strong enough. "I found him," I stated, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "Elias Thorne. I've got the full story. He worked at the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records decades ago. He had a history with the victim, a deep-seated grudge, then a sharp, excited intake of breath. User GQ, the detective's voice crackled. I read telling me I found everything, I confirmed, he's our man. The tension that had coiled in my gut for weeks finally began to loosen, replaced by a grim satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, had a long memory, and sometimes its path led through the dustiest corners of the past. Get a warrant, he's our man. The words hung in the crisp night air, a definitive period at the end of a long, convoluted sentence. The detective, a man whose face usually wore a mask of weary skepticism, nodded slowly, his gaze meeting mine with a flicker of something akin to admiration. He pulled out his phone, already barking orders into the receiver, his voice tight with purpose. The flashing lights of patrol cars, previously a distant glow, now edged closer, painting the scene in stark, urgent hues. I watched the building for another moment. The house of Meticulous lies now exposed. The tension in my shoulders began to ease, but a residual thrum of unease persisted. We had identified the perpetrator, yes, and the evidence was mounting, but a small, persistent question lingered in the back of my mind, a loose thread I hadn't quite secured. The why felt complete, but the how, the deep-seated, almost pathological how, still had a faint echo. The following morning, after the arrest was confirmed and the initial reports filed, I found myself driving not towards the lab but in the opposite direction. The detective had called, confirming the perpetrator was in custody, calm and unyielding, offering no resistance. "We've got him, user GQ, he'd said. "Thanks to you. Now we just tie up the loose ends." But for me, there was one more end, a crucial knot that only I could see. I needed to understand the true origin of this carefully constructed vendetta. My mind kept replaying a subtle detail from the perpetrator's meticulously organized study. A faded, sepia-toned photograph tucked away in a drawer, depicting an old, imposing institutional building. It wasn't the victim's current residence, nor any place we'd investigated. It had sparked a fleeting memory of something I'd read in a peripheral file, a mention of a distant relative and a past grievance. My destination was the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The facility stood on the edge of town, a hulking, gothic silhouette against the overcast sky. Ivy clawed at its crumbling brickwork, and broken windows stared out like vacant eyes. The air grew colder as I approached, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The main entrance was boarded up, but a side door, warped and splintered, offered a reluctant entry. I pushed it open, the groan of rusty hinges echoing through the cavernous space. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the gloom, illuminating peeling paint and sagging ceilings. The silence within was profound, broken only by the scuff of my shoes on scattered debris. I navigated through a labyrinth of empty wards, the ghosts of past suffering palpable in the stale air. Gurneys lay overturned, their straps dangling like forgotten limbs. The nurses' stations were ransacked, papers strewn across scarred countertops. My focus, however, was on the record's wing, a section I'd pinpointed on an old blueprint obtained from city archives. The record's wing was even worse. Stacks of file boxes, once neatly categorized, had collapsed into chaotic piles. The air here was thick with the musty odor of aging paper and forgotten lives. I pulled on a pair of gloves, the grim task ahead of me feeling less like forensic science and more like archaeology. I began to sift through the boxes, my eyes scanning for specific names, specific dates, anything that might connect the perpetrator to this place or to the victim in a way we hadn't yet considered. Hours bled into one another. My fingers grew grimy, my throat raw from the dust. Each file I opened was a glimpse into a fractured mind, a past trauma, a forgotten story. The weight of these lives pressed down on me, but I pushed through, driven by the certainty that the missing piece was here. Then, tucked away in a box marked Discharge Records 1980s, I found it. A thick, brittle file, its cover faded to an almost illegible brown. The name on the tab made my breath catch in my throat. It was the same surname as our perpetrator, but the first name was different, a sibling. Inside, the details spilled out like long-buried secrets. The patient, diagnosed with severe paranoid delusions, had been admitted after a violent incident. What truly seized my attention was a series of meticulously penned complaints within the file, handwritten by the patient's primary visitor *, our perpetrator. The complaints detailed alleged neglect, mistreatment, and a specific incident involving a nurse who, the perpetrator claimed, had deliberately withheld medication, leading to a severe psychotic break. The nurse's name was prominently mentioned. It was the victim's maiden name. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The victim hadn't just been a target of opportunity, he had been the target of decades-old vengeance. The perpetrator's meticulous planning, the layers of misdirection, the almost theatrical staging, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just a crime of passion, but a slow-burning, carefully nurtured resentment, fueled by a perceived injustice from a lifetime ago. The patient's tragic decline, documented in these crumbling pages, had been twisted into a motive for murder. I carefully photographed the relevant pages, my hands steady despite the tremor of discovery. The final piece of the puzzle, the true, agonizing root of the perpetrator's actions, lay exposed. It wasn't just about the current circumstances, it was about a past that had festered, waiting for its moment. The air outside felt fresh, clean, a stark contrast to the dust and despair I'd left behind. The case was truly closed now, not just legally but existentially. I climbed into my vehicle, the weight of the old hospital, of all those forgotten lives, settling somewhere deep within me. This was the work, the endless pursuit of truth, one fragment at a time. The satisfaction was grim but real. My phone buzzed, a new case alert. The work, as always, continued.